Mum, we've scheduled a driver for you. You can't be trusted with the car anymore. The words hung in the air of my own kitchen, sharp and cold, like a shard of glass. My son, Mark, said them. He stood by the counter, arms crossed over his expensive polo shirt. My daughter, Sarah, sat across from me, nodding slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line of pity. The coffee in my favorite yellow mug had gone cold. A knot of pure, icy fear tightened in my stomach. They weren't just talking about my 10-year-old sedan. They were talking about my legs, my freedom. I've been driving for 50 years, I said. My voice sounded small. I've never had an accident. We're just being proactive, Sarah said, her voice syrupy sweet. For your safety. She reached across the table to pat my hand, but I pulled it away to wrap it around my mug. The ceramic was smooth and cool. Outside, the church bells rang for noon, a sound that had comforted me my whole life. Today, it sounded like a warning. They were taking my keys. I knew my house would be next. Later that afternoon, Mark sat at my little desk in the corner of the living room. The desk where my husband, Bill, used to pay all our bills. The drawer smelled faintly of old paper and peppermint candies. Mark pulled out my checkbook and the stack of envelopes. "Let me simplify this for you, Mum," he said, not looking at me. He was busy clicking a fancy silver pen. "It's too much to keep track of. I'll get everything set up for automatic payments from your account." He patted my hand, a quick, dismissive gesture. "I'll just bring you a cash allowance each week for your groceries and little things. Won't that be easier?" An allowance. I was 72 years old, and my son was offering me an allowance. I felt the hot blush of shame creep up my neck. The hum of the refrigerator suddenly seemed very loud in the quiet room. I was a guest in my own life, a child in the house I had built. The next day, it was Sarah's turn. I heard the clatter of cans and boxes from the pantry. I walked in to find her reorganizing everything, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Mum, you have so much junk in here," she sighed, holding up a box of my favorite oatmeal cookies. "This is just a diabetic risk waiting to happen." Before I could protest, she dropped the cookies into a large black trash bag. The crinkle of the plastic sounded final. I didn't say a word. I just watched her strip my shelves of the small comforts I enjoyed. Later, I was watering the petunias on my porch when she left. She opened the trunk of her SUV to put her purse inside, and I saw it. Tucked beside a yoga mat and a case of sparkling water was my box of oatmeal cookies. The familiar red and white packaging was unmistakable in the bright afternoon sun. She closed the trunk quickly. She didn't know I saw. Mark came over on Saturday to set up my online banking. He sat in front of my old desktop computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The whirring of the machine filled the room. I stood behind him, trying to see the screen. "What's the password?" I asked. "I should write it down." He gave a little laugh. "It's too complicated for you, Mum. Don't worry about it. Just let me handle it." He logged out and shut down the computer, patting the monitor like a good dog. "All set. No more stress for you." But the paper statement still came in the mail the following week. My hands trembled a little as I opened it. My eyes scanned the columns of numbers. Most of it looked normal. The electric bill, the pharmacy. But then I saw it. A withdrawal for $500, paid to something called Henderson Consulting. I had never heard of Henderson Consulting in my life. I was weeding my rose bushes when my neighbor, Carol, leaned over the fence. The smell of fresh-cut grass was thick in the air. "Morning, Eleanor," she said, wiping her brow with a gloved hand. "Say, who was that fellow in the suit at your place last week? I saw him taking pictures of the house from the sidewalk. My blood went cold. A man in a suit? When? Tuesday, I think. Drove a dark grey sedan. That night, when Sarah called for her nightly check-in, I kept my voice light. Carol mentioned she saw an insurance assessor here on Tuesday. Did you schedule that? There was a tiny pause. Oh, right. Yes, I did, Sarah said, her voice perfectly smooth. Just a routine update for the homeowner's policy. Nothing to worry about. But it was something to worry about. An insurance man doesn't just take pictures from the sidewalk. I knew, deep in my bones, that she was lying. My world had gotten so much smaller. It used to be filled with friends and church and my garden club. Now, it was just the four walls of my house and the sound of the television. I decided to call my old friend Mildred. We hadn't spoken in a few weeks, and I just needed to hear a familiar, friendly voice. I picked up the phone in the kitchen, but before I could dial, Sarah picked up the extension in the living room. "Hello?" she said, her voice bright and false. I heard Mildred on the other end, asking for me. "Oh, Mildred, hi," Sarah said, her tone dropping into that syrupy, concerned voice she used now. "Mom's having a bit of a bad day. She's not really up for talking." I stood there, receiver pressed to my ear, listening to my daughter lie. I heard Mildred say, "Oh, the poor dear. Tell her I'm thinking of her." Sarah hung up with a soft click. The silence in the house was heavy, like a wool blanket in summer. She was cutting me off, one friend at a time. A few days later, Mark came over. He didn't bring coffee or donuts, just a stiff leather briefcase that smelled like money and impatience. He spread a thick stack of papers on my clean dining room table. The overhead light glinted off the paper clips. "Just some standard estate planning updates, Mom," he said, not looking at me. "We need to get this sorted out." I picked up the top page. The print was small, full of words I didn't understand. "Can I have a day or two to read this, Mark?" I asked. My voice sounded small in the big room. He tapped his shiny black pen on the table. Tap, tap, tap. "It's all standard stuff," he said, his jaw tight. "Just sign here and here." He pushed the papers toward me, the pen resting on top. I took it. It was one of those fancy pens from a bank. I remembered I had an identical one in my junk drawer, one that had run out of ink months ago. I'd kept it because it looked nice. While he was looking at his phone, I switched them. I moved my hand across the signature lines, pressing just hard enough. He never even looked up. That evening, I was walking from the living room to the kitchen when I heard their voices in the hallway. They thought I was napping in my chair, with the television murmuring. Sarah's voice was a sharp whisper. "The doctor said one more episode and he'll sign off on it." My hand froze on the doorframe. The wood felt rough under my fingers. Mark's voice was low and steady. "Just keep an eye on her. It won't be long now." An episode. They were waiting for me to get confused, to forget a name, to burn the toast. They weren't just waiting for it. They were hoping for it. The floor felt like it had dropped out from under me, and I was falling in the dark. The next morning, the documents Mark had left were still sitting on the dining room table, a monument to their greed. I put on a good show. I carried my glass of ice water over to the table, pretending to look for my reading glasses. My hand slipped. The water cascaded over the papers, turning the neat black type into blurry grey rivers. The ink from their lawyer's letterhead bled across the page in a sad purple smear. I waited an hour, then called Mark. I made my voice tremble just a little. "Oh, Mark, I am so sorry," I said, a little quaver in my tone. "I'm so clumsy." I spilled water all over those important papers you left." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then a deep, heavy sigh of pure exasperation. That sound didn't hurt me. It felt like a tiny spark, and it landed right in the cold, scared part of my heart, setting a small, steady fire. Sarah arrived the following afternoon. She didn't come alone. A woman stood beside her on the porch, holding a clipboard and wearing a polo shirt with a company logo on it. "Mum, this is Angela," Sarah announced, walking right in. "She's a caregiver. I thought you two could have a little chat." The woman, Angela, gave me a kind, pitying smile. The kind of smile you give a stray dog or a sick child. I stood up straight. I looked past Sarah, directly at Angela. "It is a pleasure to meet you," I said, my voice calm and clear. "But I believe there has been a misunderstanding. The position is not available." I walked to the door and held it open. Angela looked at Sarah, confused. I just smiled politely. After a moment, the woman scurried out. I closed the door, leaving Sarah standing alone in my entryway. Her face was pale with fury, her mouth a thin, hard line. She didn't say a word, but her eyes promised there would be consequences. Mark's wife always insisted on Sunday dinner at their house. She said it was for me, so I wouldn't have to cook. But it felt more like a summons than an invitation. The air in their home was always too cold from the air conditioning, and the smell of her lemon floor polish gave me a headache. During dinner, I excused myself, saying I needed an aspirin. Their guest bathroom was occupied, so Mark waved me toward his home office. "Use the one in there, Mom." The room was neat and dark. A large wooden desk sat in the center, gleaming under a small lamp. As I opened the door to the little bathroom, my eyes caught a folder sitting on the corner of the desk. It was a simple manila folder, but my name was written on the tab in Mark's tidy block letters. My heart gave a little thump. I told myself to walk away, but I didn't. My hand trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single letter on thick, creamy paper. It was from a law firm. I read the words Elder Asset Management, Power of Attorney, and the phrase that made the floor feel like it was tilting. Initial steps for a competency hearing. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my little smartphone steady. The air in the office was thick and silent, except for the low hum of the computer. I aimed the phone's camera at the letter, my thumb fumbling with the button on the screen. The first picture was blurry, so was the second. I took a deep breath, held the phone with both hands, and pressed the button one more time. The little click of the camera shutter sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. I quickly put the folder back exactly where I found it. Walking back to the dinner table, a strange, cold calm settled over me. This was not about my health or my safety. This was war. The next morning, I told Sarah I needed to go to the library to return some books. She offered to do it for me, but I insisted I needed the walk. The library smelled of old paper and dust, a scent that had always comforted me. I didn't go to the fiction aisle. I went straight to the public computers in the back. My fingers, stiff with arthritis, slowly typed "Best Family Law Attorney" into the search bar. A name came up again and again: Evelyn Davies. The articles called her a shark. They said she never lost. I found her number and wrote it on the back of a grocery receipt. I folded the small piece of paper 4 times and tucked it deep inside my shoe, under the sole. I made one last stop at the pharmacy on the way home. The payphone on the wall felt cold and heavy in my hand. I dropped my coins in, the clinking sound echoing in my ears as I dialed the number. My first meeting with Ms. Davies was in a tall glass building downtown. Her office didn't have doilies or pictures of grandchildren. It had leather chairs that smelled rich and clean, and a huge window with a view of the entire city. She was younger than I expected, with sharp eyes and a handshake that was firm and quick. She listened to my whole story without interrupting once. When I was done, I reached into my purse and pulled out a small envelope. It was the emergency cash from my Social Security I'd been hiding in a coffee can for 20 years. "This is for the retainer," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She slid the envelope to her side of the desk without looking at it. "They started treating me like a problem to be solved," I told her, my voice quiet. "So I decided to become a problem they couldn't solve." A small, thin smile touched her lips. "Good," she said. "Now, go buy a notebook. I want you to document everything. Time, date, what was said, how it made you feel. Everything." I went to the dollar store right after I left her office. The aisles were crowded and smelled of plastic and cheap candy. I bought a simple spiral notebook with a bright blue cover and a package of ballpoint pens. That evening, after the drone of the television from the living room had faded, I sat at my little kitchen table. The house was finally quiet. I opened the notebook to the first clean, lined page. The pen felt good in my hand. I started writing. I wrote about Mark taking my checkbook. I wrote about Sarah and my favorite cookies. The more I wrote, the more the details came back to me, sharp and clear. They said my memory was failing. But as I filled the page, I realized my memory wasn't the problem at all. The problem was I remembered everything. The bus ride to the bank felt different. I wasn't going to the grocery store or the pharmacy. I was on a mission. The bank was cool and quiet, and the air hummed from the computers. I walked right up to a young teller with kind eyes. "I seem to have misplaced my bank card," I said, my voice steady. "I'll need a new one, please, and a new PIN number, just to be safe." While she worked, I asked about opening a new account, a simple checking account, just for me. She helped me fill out the forms, and I directed my monthly pension check to be deposited there from now on. It was my money, from 40 years of teaching. I watched the teller stamp the papers. It felt like she was stamping my Declaration of Independence. They thought my life was over. "I didn't die," I whispered to myself. "I just stopped being convenient." As I left, I saw Mr. Henderson, the bank manager, step out of his office. He was a golfing buddy of Mark's. He gave me a polite nod, but his eyes were full of questions. He watched me walk out the door, and I knew Mark would hear about my visit before the day was over. My new debit card arrived in a plain white envelope a few days later. I took it to the electronics store downtown. I felt a little foolish walking past all the giant televisions and complicated gadgets. I found what I was looking for in a small display case, a digital voice recorder, no bigger than my thumb. "Can I help you, Ma'am?" a young man asked. "Yes," I said, pointing. "I'd like that one. I'm joining a bird-watching club and I want to record their calls." The lie came surprisingly easy. Back home, I sat in my walk-in closet, surrounded by the faint scent of cedar and old perfume. I practiced turning it on and off. The tiny red light blinked, and I recorded my own voice. Testing, 1, 2, 3. It sounded strange and thin. That evening, when Mark and Sarah came for their weekly check-in, I slid the recorder under a napkin on the end table. My heart beat like a hummingbird's wings. The next Tuesday, the phone rang. It was Sarah, her voice sweet as pie. "Mum, hi. Listen, the girls in my book club were wondering if we could meet at your place next month. They just love your living room." I looked around my living room, at my things, my photos, my peace and quiet. For years I had always said yes. It was easier. This time I took a breath. That's kind of you to offer, Sarah, but it's not convenient for me. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear her blinking. Not convenient? She finally said, her voice losing its sweetness. What do you mean? You'll be right here? I know, I said calmly. And I'm not up for company. We can talk about it another time. Before she could argue, I said, I have to go, dear. My casserole is about to burn. I hung up the phone. The quiet that followed was the most satisfying sound I had heard in months. My next trip was to my doctor's office. The waiting room smelled of rubbing alcohol and old magazines. I went to the front desk and smiled at the receptionist. Hello, Donna. I was hoping I could get a copy of my medical records. Just for my own files, you know. With Medicare, it's good to have everything in order. She handed me a clipboard and a form. An hour later, she gave me a thick manila envelope. Back home, with a cup of tea, I started reading. It was mostly routine. Blood pressure, cholesterol. Then I found it. A note from my last visit, the one Mark had insisted on coming to. It read, Patient's son reports increasing confusion and an incident last week where she got lost for 2 hours driving home from the grocery store. I had never been lost. I had taken a detour to see the cherry blossoms by the park. I'd even told Mark about it. Seeing his casual lie written in my official medical file made my blood run cold. This wasn't just about money anymore. Ms. Davies' office was on the top floor of a glass building downtown. She had arranged an appointment for me with a doctor I had never met, a specialist in a field I couldn't even pronounce. Just a second opinion, Helen, she had said on the phone. Our own private baseline. The doctor's name was Ramirez, and he had a kind face and a calm voice. He didn't talk to me like I was a child. He asked me questions. Some were about my life, my hobbies. Some were puzzles with shapes and numbers. We talked for nearly 2 hours. At the end, he smiled warmly. Mrs. Miller, he said, you are sharper than most people half your age. The official report came a week later. I sat across the polished desk from Ms. Davies as she read it. Cognitively sound, excellent memory recall, no signs of impairment. A wave of relief washed over me, so strong I felt my eyes tear up. I had known it, but seeing it in black and white was different. Ms. Davies folded the report and slid it into a fresh folder. Excellent, she said, her voice crisp. Now we keep this to ourselves. We let them build their entire case on a rotten foundation. That secret felt heavier and more powerful than any document I had ever held. I spent 3 days at my dining room table with 2 cardboard boxes of old bank statements. The room smelled of dust and old paper. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the squeak of my yellow highlighter pen. My old librarian skills, the ones my children thought had faded with my memory, came back to me. I was organizing, cross-referencing, finding the narrative in the numbers. There it was. A monthly consulting fee to a company I'd never heard of. It started small, $50, then $100, then $200. And here was another transfer for nearly $1,000, labeled Home Repair Escrow. I looked out my window at the perfectly fine roof. My late husband, Frank, had always said, "The numbers don't lie, Helen." He was right. I highlighted the last transfer. It was dated the same day Mark had taken me out for my birthday lunch. He'd made a big show of paying the bill, patting my hand and saying, "My treat, Mom." The numbers on the page told me I'd paid for it myself, 10 times over. The car keys felt cold and foreign in my hand. They'd been sitting in the ceramic dish by the door for 2 months. a little monument to my lost freedom. Mark hadn't taken them, not yet. He just said I shouldn't drive. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic little bird in a cage. I walked into the garage, the smell of gasoline and old lawn clippings filling my nose. I only went to the grocery store. It was 3 miles away, but pulling out of my own driveway felt like crossing the ocean. My hands were clamped to the steering wheel. I checked my mirrors 3 times at every stop sign. When I finally pulled into a parking spot, I just sat there for a minute, listening to the engine tick. The sun was warm on the dashboard. I watched a young mother struggle with a wobbly shopping cart. I felt like myself again. It was a feeling so precious. I was afraid someone would see it on my face and take it away. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was in a long white envelope with a window. The paper felt heavy and important. I didn't need to open it to know what it was. I sat in my armchair, the one Frank always used, and read the words. "A petition has been filed," it said. "A hearing to determine competency." My teacup rattled in its saucer as I set it down. An hour later, Mark and Sarah's car pulled into my driveway. They let themselves in with their key. Their faces were arranged in masks of deep concern. The scent of Sarah's sharp perfume filled the hall. "Mum, we wanted to talk to you before you got this," Mark said, gesturing to the letter on my end table. "We didn't want you to be scared." "This is just a formality," Sarah added, coming to perch on the arm of my chair. "It's to protect you and your assets. We were just trying to help." I let them talk. I nodded and said, "I see." Under the small Afghan in my lap, my finger pressed the record button on the little device from the electronics store. When their speech of loving concern was finished, I folded my hands in my lap. I looked at my son, Mark, with his expensive haircut. I looked at my daughter, Sarah, with her perfectly manicured nails. The dust motes danced in the afternoon light between us. The house was completely silent. "I know what you're doing," I said. My voice didn't shake. "And I've hired a lawyer." The fake sympathy on their faces evaporated. It was like watching ice melt in reverse, hardening into something ugly. Mark's jaw literally dropped open. Sarah shot to her feet. "You did what?" she screeched. The sound was shrill in my quiet living room. "Who have you been talking to?" Mark demanded, his voice low and furious. "Has Carol been filling your head with nonsense?" They stared at me, not as their mother, but as a problem that had suddenly grown teeth. The lawyer's office smelled of lemon polish and money. The conference table was a vast, dark ocean of polished wood. A young man in a suit that was too tight in the shoulders brought in a pitcher of ice water that clinked against the glasses. My lawyer, Ms. Davies, sat beside me, calm as a statue. Her briefcase was open, but she hadn't taken anything out. Mark and Sarah came in with their lawyer, a man with silver hair and a smug smile. He didn't look at Ms. Davies. He looked right at me. "Now, Helen," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "We just want to make this as easy on you as possible." Before I could answer, Ms. Davies spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a razor. "You will address my client as Mrs. Peterson," she said. The smug lawyer blinked. He wasn't used to being corrected. He cleared his throat and shuffled his papers. Ms. Davies just gave a small, tight smile. "We look forward to our day in court," she said. I saw a flicker of something in the other lawyer's eyes. It wasn't fear, not yet. But it was the beginning of a doubt. The first thing they did was predictable. They cut me off. The joint account Mark had so kindly set up for my bills was frozen solid. He probably imagined me at the grocery store, my cart full of canned soup and tea, with a declined debit card in my hand. He probably pictured the humiliation. I got the notice in the mail, a crisp, cold letter from the bank. I ran my thumb over the official letterhead. They thought it was a finishing move. They thought money was their only weapon, and that they controlled it all. They didn't know about my little account at the credit union downtown, the one where my pension check went every month, quiet as a mouse. It wasn't a fortune, but it was mine, and it was more than enough. I put the bank letter in the folder for Ms. Davies and felt a strange sense of calm. They had played their big card, and it didn't even touch me. My neighbour Carol didn't hesitate for a second. When I asked if she would speak for me, she put her teacup down so hard it rattled in its saucer. The smell of her strong Earl Grey tea filled her little kitchen. "Martha," she said, her voice firm, "of course I will. The things they've been saying, it's nonsense." She met with Miss Davies the next afternoon. I waited on a park bench across the street, watching the pigeons. Later, Miss Davies told me Carol had been the perfect witness. She told them about my prize-winning roses, about the casseroles I brought to the church potlucks, and how we had a long talk about the new Medicare supplement plans just last week. "She knows more about deductibles than my own accountant," Carol had told her. It was a simple description of a normal life, and in that moment, it was the most powerful defense I could have. The day of the hearing, I woke up before the sun. I put on my navy blue suit, the one I saved for weddings and funerals. The fabric felt smooth and substantial under my fingers. I even put on a little lipstick. I wanted to look like a woman who managed her own affairs, not a feeble old thing who needed her children to do it for her. Mark and Sarah were already there, sitting on the other side of the sterile, wood-panelled room. They sat stiffly, not looking at me. Sarah twisted the strap of her purse. Mark just stared at the wall. The air conditioner hummed loudly, the only sound in the room. I felt a tremor in my hands, but I clasped them in my lap. I felt nervous, yes. But underneath it, I felt a solid core of strength I hadn't felt in years. I was about to buy my own life back. Their lawyer went first. He was a young man with a smug face and shiny shoes. He spoke in a soft, pitying voice, as if he felt just terrible about all this. He painted a picture of me as a sweet but confused woman, a danger to herself. "She got lost just last month, Your Honor," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Wandering for hours before her son, Mark, had to go find her." He held up a stack of papers. "And the bills. So many were late. They were just trying to help." I didn't look at Mark or Sarah. I didn't look at their lawyer. I just looked at the judge, a woman about my age with tired, intelligent eyes. I let the lies wash over me like dirty water, knowing that soon it would be my turn to show her the truth. I just had to sit through the storm first. Then it was Ms. Davies's turn. She stood up, and the whole energy of the room shifted. She didn't speak with pity. She spoke with facts. She presented my independent cognitive assessment, the doctor's signature clear and strong at the bottom. She showed the judge my financial statements, with my own neat highlighting on every consulting fee Mark had paid himself. Then she took out the small digital recorder. "And now, Your Honor," she said calmly, "I'd like to play a short recording from Mrs. Miller's home, dated October 12th. She pressed the button. The speakers crackled, and then Sarah's voice filled the silent room. The doctor said one more episode, and he'll sign off on it. Then Mark's voice, low and conspiratorial. "Just keep an eye on her. It won't be long." A woman in the back of the courtroom gasped. Mark's face went the color of spoiled milk. Sarah just stared at the recorder, her mouth hanging open, And then she began to cry, a horrible, gulping sound. The judge leaned forward, her gaze fixed not on me, but on my two children, and her expression was one of pure, undiluted contempt. The judge dismissed the case with prejudice. That meant they could never, ever try this again. He took off his reading glasses and leaned forward, the wood of his bench looking dark and heavy. He looked right at Mark and Sarah. He spoke for a full 5 minutes, but his voice was quiet. He talked about dignity and respect and greed that wears the mask of concern. I watched my children shrink in their chairs. Mark's face went from white to a blotchy red. Sarah just stared at her hands, her shoulders shaking. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt a deep, weary sadness. When the judge finally said, "This court is adjourned," the sound of his gavel was like a crack of thunder in the silent room. I stood up, smoothed my suit jacket, and walked out without looking back. The next day, I called a courier service. I gave them 2 large manila envelopes. One was addressed to my son, Mark, at his office downtown. The other was for my daughter, Sarah, at her big house in the suburbs. Inside each envelope was a copy of the final, itemized bill from Ms. Davies's law firm. It was a very large number. Tucked into the invoice, I had placed a small, simple note card, the kind you buy in a pack of 10 at the grocery store. On it, I had written just 7 words in my neatest script. "My mind is sharper than your greed." I sealed the envelopes myself and watched the courier's van pull away from my curb. The engine noise faded, and the street was quiet again. For 3 full days, there was absolute silence. No phone calls, no angry text messages, no car pulling into my driveway. The quiet wasn't empty. It felt like a warm, heavy blanket settling over the house. On the 3rd day, I had a locksmith come over. He was a young man with kind eyes. "You want all 3 doors done?" he asked, holding up a shiny new deadbolt. "Yes, please," I said. "Everything." He worked for over an hour. The sound of his drill was loud, but I didn't mind. It was the sound of change. When he was finished, he handed me a set of 3 new keys on a simple silver ring. They felt cool and solid in my palm. The quiet in my house felt different now. It felt safe. The phone rang late that afternoon. It was Mark. His voice was tight with a rage I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. "A bill? You sent me a bill? After everything we've done for you?" I held the phone a few inches from my ear. I listened to him sputter about gratitude and family, and how could I be so cruel? The hum of my refrigerator seemed louder than his voice. When he finally paused to take a breath, I spoke. "You will pay it," I said, and my own voice was calm and clear as a church bell on a Sunday morning. Then I hung up the phone. I looked at his name on the screen for a long moment. Then I pressed the button that said, "Block this caller." A moment later, I found Sarah's number and did the same thing. I had another meeting with Ms. Davies the following week. Her office smelled of old books and faint perfume. We didn't talk about the hearing. We talked about the future. My future. She explained what a living trust was, how it would protect my assets better than a simple will. "Are you certain about the beneficiaries, Helen?" she asked gently, peering at me over her glasses. "Absolutely," I said. My children's names were not in the document. Instead, the money would go into an educational trust for my grandchildren, managed by the bank. They would have it for college or trade school, but Mark and Sarah could never touch a penny of it. "My grandchildren are protected," I told her. "That's what matters now." I put my house on the market the following Monday. My realtor, a nice young man named David, was very efficient. He put a handsome sign on my front lawn, right next to the prize-winning rose bushes my late husband, George, had planted. That sign was the most beautiful thing I'd seen in years. It was a declaration of independence. Of course, it didn't take long for the fallout. The president of our homeowners association, a woman named Beverly, who was a close friend of Sarah's, called me that afternoon. "Eleanor, I hear you're selling," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "We'll need to do a full compliance inspection. There are some new rules about landscaping that your property might be violating." I knew for a fact my landscaping was perfect. I also knew Beverly was Sarah's little messenger. The trouble was just beginning. I didn't get angry. I got busy. I went down to my basement and pulled out the thick binder with all the HOA bylaws. I spent an hour with a cup of tea and a yellow highlighter. The next morning, I walked over to Beverly's house and rang the bell. She opened the door in her bathrobe, looking surprised. "Beverly?" I said, holding up a photocopied page. "I just wanted to point out Rule 7B. It states that any new landscaping regulations only apply to new construction or major renovations. And here," I handed her another page, "is Rule 12C, which outlines the penalties for board members using their position to harass a resident." I smiled sweetly. My lawyer, Evelyn Davies, found it particularly interesting. The colour drained from Beverly's face. The trouble stopped immediately. The house sold in less than a week. A young family with 2 small children bought it for over the asking price. I felt a small pang when I walked through the empty rooms for the last time. I could almost hear the echo of my children's laughter when they were young, before greed had poisoned them. I touched the worn spot on the kitchen linoleum where I'd stood for hours, rolling out pie crusts. But it wasn't regret I felt. It was relief. I handed the keys to David, my realtor. He shook my hand. "Congratulations, Eleanor," he said. "On to the next chapter." He was right. I wasn't just selling a house full of old memories. I was buying my freedom. I moved into a beautiful 2-bedroom apartment at the Oak Haven Independent Living Community. It wasn't a nursing home. It was a place for people who were still active but wanted security and company. My apartment had a small, sunny balcony that overlooked a rose garden. The hum of the air conditioner was quiet and steady. The moving men arranged my familiar furniture, my favourite armchair, my reading lamp, the cedar chest George had made for me. When they left, I stood alone in the quiet. It was smaller than my house, but it felt enormous. It was a space that was entirely mine. No one would come in and rearrange my pantry. No one would take my checkbook from the kitchen drawer. That first night, I didn't feel lonely. I felt peaceful. The next week, I saw a notice on the community bulletin board for a book club meeting. I hadn't been in a book club in years. I felt a little flutter of nerves, but I smoothed down my blouse and went. There were 6 other women there, gathered in a cozy library with a faint, pleasant smell of old paper and lemon polish. "We're reading a mystery this month," a woman with bright silver hair told me. "The ending is terrible. We plan to complain about it for at least an hour." Another woman, named Martha, poured me a small glass of red wine. "Welcome," she said. "We're glad to have you. What do you like to read?" We talked and argued about characters and plots for 2 hours. We laughed. I felt a part of my brain wake up that had been sleeping for a long, long time. I was Eleanor again. Not Mom, not Grandma, just Eleanor. A week later, a letter arrived. It was in Sarah's loopy, self-important handwriting. I let it sit on the little table by the door for a full day, right next to a potted violet. I wasn't afraid of it. I was just deciding if it was worth my time. Finally, I slit it open with my butter knife. It was full of apologies that sounded like accusations. We were just so worried about you, she wrote. You made us do it, Mum. We were only trying to help. I read that line twice. The same words she'd used in my kitchen, the day this all started. I folded the letter neatly, not out of respect, but out of habit. I walked to the kitchen, tore it into 4 precise squares, and dropped them into the trash can. The lid made a soft thump as it closed. I didn't need her excuses. I needed my life back, and I was already living it. That Tuesday, I started a weekly poker game. There were 3 other women in my building who played. Gloria, a retired math teacher who could calculate odds in her head. Betty, who used to own a bar and could bluff with the best of them. And Joan, who just liked the company and the cheap white wine we drank from juice glasses. I raise you $1, Eleanor, Gloria said, her eyes twinkling over her cards. The plastic chips clicked together in the quiet of the common room. You're a shark, Gloria, I said, laughing as I pushed my dollar into the pot. I lost $10 that first night. I also laughed until my sides hurt. It was the best $10 I had ever spent. The next week, I saw a notice on the community bulletin board. The local library needed volunteers for their children's story hour. It felt like a sign. I used to be a librarian, a long, long time ago, before Mark was born. The smell of old books and paper has always felt like home to me. On my first day, a little girl with bright red pigtails climbed into my lap. She smelled like graham crackers and sunshine. Can you read the one about the grumpy ladybug? She whispered, pointing a chubby finger at the book. I certainly can, I told her. I know a thing or two about being grumpy. I held the book for all the children to see. For the first time in years, I felt completely and quietly useful. My purpose was my own again. The mail continued to come. One afternoon, I found a crisp business envelope in my box. It was from Mark's accounting firm. There was no letter inside, no note. Just a check, printed by a computer, for his exact half of Ms. Davies's legal bill. The silence of it was colder than any angry words he could have written. I put on my walking shoes and went straight to the bank. I endorsed the back of the check with a firm hand and pushed it under the glass to the teller. Just a deposit, please, I said. The money was in my account. The transaction was finished. But as I walked home, I realized Sarah's check had still not arrived. I waited 1 week. Then I made a call. I didn't call Sarah. I called Ms. Davies. She hasn't paid, I said, my voice calm. The hum of the air conditioner in my little apartment filled the silence. I see, Ms. Davies said. Her voice was like ice. Consider it handled, Eleanor. I don't know what her letter said, but it must have been effective. 10 days later, another envelope arrived with Sarah's handwriting on it. Inside, the check was crumpled, as if it had been squeezed in a fist. I could see a small, watery smudge near the signature line. I smoothed it out on my kitchen table. Then I took it to the bank. The debt was finally paid. The last string had been cut. My neighbour from my old house, Carol, came to visit me the next week. We sat on my new balcony, the sun warm on our faces, with a plate of store-bought lemon cookies between us. The teacups clinked softly as she set hers down. The air smelled of freshly cut grass from the community garden below. It's not the same on the old street without you, Martha, she said, her kind eyes crinkling at the corners. I miss our chats over the fence. I miss them too, I told her, and I meant it. But this is a new chapter. She looked around at the potted geraniums, at the peaceful view. It's a beautiful chapter, she said. You look so at peace. I realized then that I wasn't just living alone. I was building a new family, one chosen friend at a time. I decided to do something I had put off for 30 years. I booked a seat on a bus tour of the New England coast to see the autumn leaves. The rumble of the bus was a soothing hum. The air through the cracked open window smelled of salt and crisp, damp earth. The trees were a blaze of red and gold, more beautiful than any picture. At a little gift shop in a town in Vermont, I bought a handful of postcards. I sent one to Carol, one to my new friends from the poker game, and one to Evelyn Davies. I wrote about the colours of the trees and the taste of the apple cider. A woman sitting across the aisle smiled at me. "First time seeing the foliage?" "No," I said, putting a stamp on the last card. "But it's the first time I've done it just for me." I did not buy postcards for Mark or Sarah. When I got back, I went to the community centre to check my email. The computer hummed quietly in the silent room. There was a message from a name I hadn't seen in months. It was from my oldest grandson, Peter, who was away at college. My heart gave a little lurch. I clicked it open. The words were short and simple. "Grandma, Mom and Dad won't tell me what happened. They said you moved and won't talk to them. Are you okay?" I took a deep breath. I typed back, my fingers moving slowly over the keys. "Peter, my dear, I am more than okay. I am happy. Let's talk on the phone next week. I'll call you." The thought of that phone call hung in the air, a final piece of business I knew I had to handle. He answered on the first ring. I sat in the armchair by my window, looking out at the garden as I held the phone to my ear. His voice was young and full of concern. "Grandma? Are you really okay?" "I am, sweetheart. I'm living in a very nice new place," I told him. He hesitated. "Mom said... She said you were having trouble, that you weren't thinking clearly." The old lie, passed down to a new generation. It didn't even sting anymore. "Sometimes, Peter," I said calmly, "people see what they want to see, especially when money is involved. Your grandmother's mind is just fine. In fact, it's never been clearer." I told him a simple, honest version of the story. I left out the ugliest parts, but I told him the truth. He was quiet for a long moment when I finished. Then he just said, "I'm so glad you're okay, Grandma. I miss you." Relief washed over me. So strong it felt like a wave. On Tuesday afternoons, the community centre offered a watercolour class. I had never held a paintbrush in my life, but I signed up anyway. The room smelled of wet paper and something sharp, like turpentine. My hands, which had trembled so badly taking a picture of that lawyer's letter, were surprisingly steady. The instructor was a patient woman with paint smudged on her cheek. "Don't worry if it's not perfect," she told the class. "Just enjoy the colours." I decided to paint the view from my balcony, the green of the garden, the blue of the sky, the red of my geraniums. The result was a wobbly, colourful mess. It looked like a child had painted it. But as I looked at it, a smile spread across my face. It was terrible, and I absolutely loved it. It was mine. I thought about Mark and Sarah sometimes. It wasn't a sharp pain anymore, not the kind that steals your breath. It was more like watching an old movie on a rainy afternoon, one where you already know the sad ending. I saw them not as monsters, but as two weak people who let their worst instincts take over. My friend Carol, from the poker game, saw me looking out the window one day. "A penny for your thoughts, Eleanor," she said, setting down her cup of tea. The steam smelled like cinnamon. "I was just thinking about my children," I told her. "Ah," she said, and she didn't say anything else. She just patted my hand. I felt a strange sense of pity for them, for the emptiness that must live inside a person to make them do such things. It was a quiet, lonely feeling, and I was glad when it passed. The man who ran the community garden was named Arthur. He was a widower with kind, crinkly eyes and hands that knew their way around soil. He helped me plant a small herb box on my balcony. The rich, dark dirt felt cool against my fingers. "You've got a good spot for rosemary here," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It gets the morning sun." I smiled. My son, Mark, always told me I had a brown thumb. Arthur snorted softly. "Nonsense," he said, patting the soil around a small basil plant. "You just need the right plant and the right spot, and a little bit of patience." He looked up at me, his eyes gentle. "I have some prize-winning roses behind the main building, if you'd ever care to see them." I was in complete control of my money, my social security, my pension, my small investments. Every morning, I would sit at my little kitchen table with my tablet and a cup of coffee. The hum of the air conditioner was a steady, comforting sound. I checked my accounts online all by myself. I even learned how to rebalance my own portfolio. My grandson, Kevin, called me one afternoon. "Grandma, just checking in. You doing okay?" "Better than okay, dear," I said, clicking the mouse on my laptop. "I just moved some money from my growth stocks into some safer bonds. The market is making me nervous." There was a pause on the line. "Wow, Grandma," he said, and I could hear the surprise in his voice. "You know more about that than I do." The feeling of competence was quiet, but it was as solid and real as the ceramic mug in my hand. My poker group was getting ambitious. Betty, the retired math teacher, came to our weekly game with a stack of brochures. The colourful paper felt slick under my fingers as she passed them around. The smell of her strong coffee filled my small apartment. "All right, ladies," she announced, her eyes gleaming. "I've priced out the bus and the hotel. 3 nights in Atlantic City. Who's in?" Another friend, Joyce, fiddled with her glasses. "Oh, I don't know, Betty. All that noise." I looked at their faces, at the mix of fear and excitement. I thought about all the years I had said no to things, all the trips I had put off. I pushed a stack of chips into the center of the table. "I'm in," I said. The idea was both terrifying and absolutely wonderful. I was sitting on my balcony at dusk. A small glass of white wine sat on the table next to me, sweating in the warm evening air. The sky was turning a soft, bruised purple over the tops of the trees. My first watercolor painting, the one of this very view, was taped to the inside of the glass door. It was terrible, but it was mine. I heard the faint sound of laughter from a nearby apartment and the distant chime of church bells. I was not waiting for a phone call. I was not waiting for a visit. I was simply at peace, in a life that I had built for myself.